The morning of June the 5th, 1944. Somewhere in Bavaria, inside a mountain retreat that smelled of pine and fresh bread, a German field marshal sat beside his wife and quietly sang her happy birthday. Outside the windows, the Alps were serene. The air tasted clean. The war felt very far away. He was relaxed. He had every reason to be. His name was Erwin Rommel, and before leaving the front, he had received one guarantee. His meteorologists had confirmed it. The weather in the English Channel was catastrophic. Seas at 6 feet, cloud ceiling at 0. No invasion force in the world would attempt a crossing in conditions like these. He had a few days, maybe a week, enough time to drive home. Enough time to celebrate the woman who had waited for him through the campaigns of North Africa, through every grinding year of this war. Enough time for one quiet birthday. He was wrong. Not in the small way commanders sometimes get things wrong. He was wrong in the way that changes the outcome of a war. He was wrong in the way that history remembers forever. And the most devastating part of Rommel's one fatal mistake was not that he left for Bavaria. It was not that he trusted the weather report. The true catastrophe had begun months earlier. It began in a conference room in France, in an argument that no one fully won, and in a compromise that guaranteed everyone would lose. To understand what Rommel got wrong, you first have to understand what Rommel got right. Because this is not the story of a fool. This is the story of one of the most gifted commanders of the entire Second World War. A man who had spent 2 years in the North African desert watching his brilliant German armor get hunted from the sky. A man who had learned, at devastating personal cost, a lesson that none of his fellow generals were willing to learn alongside him. That lesson would become the foundation of everything. It would also be the thing they took away from him. When Hitler appointed Rommel to command the Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943, the man who arrived was not the famous desert fox of the propaganda posters. He was something more dangerous. He was a general who had been educated by catastrophe. He had watched his elite tank columns, veterans of 1,000 desert battles, reduced to burning wreckage. Not by a British general being cleverer, not by better tanks on the other side, by Allied aircraft, by the simple, terrible fact that any German armored column moving across open ground in daylight would be found from the air and destroyed before it could fight. He had watched Allied air power turn movement itself into suicide. He had felt the shockwave of those attacks. He had survived them. And he had drawn one clear, unshakable conclusion from everything he had witnessed and survived. The conclusion was this. If the Allies ever established a foothold on French soil, if they got even one toe on the beach and held it, German armor would never be able to reach them in time. The fighter bombers would see to that. Any column of tanks trying to reach the coast in daylight would drive into a corridor of fire and black smoke and would never arrive. The only chance Germany had was to hit the Allied forces while they were still in the water, before they organized. Before they unpacked their air power, before the great machine got running. The first hours of the invasion were everything. Miss that window, and the war in the West was already over. This was Rommel's plan. Move the Panzer divisions right up to the coast. Not 40 miles inland. Not 100 miles inland. Right up to the beaches, hidden in the forests and orchards and sunken lanes of the Norman countryside. The moment the first Allied soldier set foot on the sand, those tanks would roll. They would reach the beach, while the enemy was still in the surf, still disorganized, still bleeding from the crossing. One violent, concentrated hammer blow, and the invasion would die in the water. It was simple, it was bold, it was almost certainly the only plan that had any chance of working, and it was denied. On the other side of this argument stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He was the Commander-in-Chief West. He was 70 years old. He was Prussian military tradition made flesh. He had read Clausewitz the way other men read their Bible. and his vision of the coming battle was the complete opposite of Rommel's. Von Rundstedt wanted to let the Allies land. Let them come ashore, he argued. Let them struggle through the surf and dig in and extend their supply lines. Then, when they were most committed and most exposed, Germany would strike. One massive armored counterattack, a single decisive blow that would drive the Allies back into the sea and settle the matter in an afternoon. It had worked in 1940. It had destroyed France in 6 weeks. Von Rundstedt believed it would work again. 2 field marshals, 2 completely opposite plans. One believed the invasion had to be beaten in the first 5 minutes. The other believed the decisive moment would come days later, in a grand armored battle far from the beaches. Both men were certain they were right. Both men were convinced the other was dangerously wrong. And the man who had to choose between them was Adolf Hitler. Hitler chose neither. He split the difference. He gave Rommel direct control of 3 panzer divisions, including the 21st Panzer stationed near the city of Caen. 3 divisions for a coastline stretching hundreds of miles, but the 4 most powerful armored formations in the entire West, the elite divisions that represented the true striking power of Germany's armored arm, were held back. They were placed under a central reserve, not under Rommel, not under von Rundstedt, under Hitler's own personal military headquarters, the OKW. And the release of those divisions, if and when an invasion came, required the personal authorization of one man, Adolf Hitler, who liked to sleep late, and who had left strict orders that he was not to be disturbed. Think carefully about what that meant in practice. If the Allies landed, a commander on the front line would have to contact his corps headquarters. His corps headquarters would contact the Army Group. The Army Group would contact von Rundstedt in Paris. Von Rundstedt would contact the OKW in Germany. And somewhere in that headquarters, an aide would have to physically walk down a corridor and knock on the Führer's door and ask permission to wake him up and present the request. Then Hitler would have to read the reports, make the decision, and send the order back down the same chain in reverse. In a battle where Rommel himself had written that the first 24 hours would be decisive, in a battle where every minute mattered, the German command structure had guaranteed hours of paralysis before a single tank could move. Rommel knew this. He argued against it with everything he had. He had seen what delay cost. He had watched his own armies pay for delay with their lives and their machines in the African desert. He made his case. He was overruled, and he was left commanding the defense of France with 3 panzer divisions where he needed 10. He did what he could. He drove the coast himself, week after week, pushing local commanders to lay more mines, build more obstacles, strengthen the most likely landing sites. He pushed the 21st Panzer into position near Caen because it was the one armored unit he actually controlled. He planned for every scenario he could imagine. And then, convinced that the storm in the Channel had bought him several days, he drove home to Bavaria to sing happy birthday to his wife. June the 5th, 1944. Just after midnight. Across the Norman countryside, hundreds of American paratroopers were falling from the sky. They came from transports flying through anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a solid wall of flame. The wind scattered them across a huge area. They landed in fields and marshes and flooded lowlands. Hundreds drowned in the fields that Rommel's own engineers had deliberately flooded to stop exactly this kind of attack. But thousands hit the ground and began to move. And the reports that came flooding into the German headquarters were chaos. Paratroopers here, paratroopers there. Reports that contradicted each other, reports that formed no coherent picture, reports that seemed, deliberately, to describe an attack happening everywhere and nowhere at the same time. General Erich Marx commanded the German 84th Corps. He stood over a map covered in pins marking reported paratrooper sightings. The pins were scattered across the entire region with no pattern, no clear axis of attack, no obvious objective. His military instincts immediately told him what he was looking at: a diversion. His intelligence officers had been telling him for months that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, where the crossing was shortest and the roads to Germany were most direct. This confused, scattered airborne drop had every sign of a feint, a trick designed to pull German reserves away from the real battle before it started. If he committed his only armored unit to chase paratroopers in the dark, and the main Allied fleet appeared offshore at dawn, the game would be over before it began. He made his decision. He waited. Across Normandy, every senior German commander was making the same decision: wait. Report upward. Ask for guidance. The information traveled up the chain in the darkness, while the minutes ticked by and could not be recovered. Von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris received the reports and was skeptical. His chief of staff concluded it was probably a large-scale raid, not the invasion itself. No one in the senior German command structure was prepared to believe, at 2 a.m, that the decisive battle of the entire Western War had just begun. The instinct to be cautious, to wait for more information, to avoid the catastrophic mistake of committing reserves to the wrong battle, was overwhelming. And so they waited. At 5:50 a.m, the city appeared. That is the only way to describe what the men in the Atlantic Wall bunkers saw when the morning mist began to lift from the water. Not a fleet, a city. An enormous, impossible steel city that had materialized on the horizon overnight. Hundreds of warships. Thousands of landing craft. The entire weight of Allied industrial power translated into something that sat on the channel and stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. Major Werner Pluskat, an artillery officer who got a clear view through his rangefinder, later said he could not find words for what he saw. The armada was so vast it did not look like a military force. It looked, he said, like the horizon had been replaced. He called his headquarters. He told them the numbers. The officer on the other end asked him to repeat himself. The number did not seem possible. Before the German command structure could process what it was seeing, before a single request for authorization could begin its slow journey up through the chain to the man who could actually order the panzers to move, the armada opened fire. 16 battleships, dozens of cruisers, over 100 destroyers, all of them firing together in one coordinated, rolling barrage, designed to do one specific thing: not just destroy the concrete bunkers, destroy the connections between them, sever the telephone wires, silence the field radios, break the Atlantic Wall apart from the outside, so that what remained was not a defensive line, but a collection of isolated positions, each one cut off from the others, each one alone in a sea of fire and noise and choking concrete dust. The system that was supposed to coordinate the German defense was dismantled in minutes. The men inside the bunkers were no longer soldiers in a line. They were men on islands, with no way to call for help, no way to report what they were seeing, and no way to know what was happening 50 yards to their left or their right. Miles inland near Caen, the 21st Panzer Division heard the thunder and felt the earth move. These were Rommel's tanks, his one armored unit close enough to matter, his designated fire brigade for exactly this moment. And they waited. Their commander, General-Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger, had been in Paris the night before. By the time he returned and began working through the chain of command, precious hours had already gone. Permission for a limited counterattack against British paratroopers east of the Orne River arrived at 9 a.m, nearly 3 hours after the naval guns had opened fire, nearly 3 hours after the landing craft had hit the beaches. The permission, when it came, was not for what Rommel had built the division to do. It was not a counterattack on the beaches. It was a limited, cautious response to one piece of the airborne landing, while the main invasion poured ashore 5 miles to the north. The division did eventually fight its way toward the coast. By mid-afternoon, a column under Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski had pushed through the chaos and actually reached the English Channel. He had found a gap between two of the Allied landing zones. For a brief moment, he stood on the Norman shore and looked at the water and understood that he had accomplished something remarkable. Something that, under a different command structure, in a different war with a different chain of authorization, might have been the beginning of a real counterattack. Then he heard the sound. Every German soldier on the Western Front had learned to dread it. A high-pitched screaming from above that grew louder very fast and ended in an explosion. The Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers, typhoons and thunderbolts dropping from the sky with rockets and bombs. A Panzer crew sealed inside their tank felt the world compress and then explode when a rocket found the vehicle beside them. The radio would carry one last shout and then go silent. The 21st Panzer's counterattack was broken not by German armor being outfought on the ground, but by air power that made the ground itself dangerous. By evening, Oppeln-Bronikowski had lost dozens of tanks. The attack was finished, and the Allies were ashore. Rommel's greatest fear had become reality in a single afternoon. Elsewhere in France, Germany's best armored units were losing a different kind of battle. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division. It was arguably the finest armored force in the entire Wehrmacht. Well-equipped, well-trained, and positioned about 100 miles from Normandy. Bayerlein spent the morning of June 6th on the telephone, his voice hoarse with frustration, pleading for permission to move toward the coast. His request went from his own headquarters to the Corps. The Corps agreed, but had no authority to act. They sent it to the Army Group. The Army Group also agreed, and also had no authority. The request went to von Rundstedt in Paris. Von Rundstedt, by now deeply alarmed, formally petitioned Hitler's personal headquarters, the OKW. The request arrived at Hitler's retreat in Bavaria. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, read the reports from Normandy. He understood what they meant. He also understood that the Führer was asleep. Hitler had left strict orders. He was not to be disturbed. Jodl and his staff stood in the clean mountain air of Bavaria, far from the smoke and the dying on the beaches of Normandy, and they debated. If they woke Hitler and this turned out to be a feint, they would face his rage. If they let him sleep, and this was the real invasion, they would be blamed for the disaster. They could not resolve the question, so they waited. The most powerful armored reserve in the Western theater sat idle, engines cold, crews standing beside their vehicles in the French countryside, listening to the distant sound of naval guns they could not see, watching the sky to the north glow orange with fire, wondering why the order they had been trained to receive since 1943 had still not come. The most important military decision of the day was being held hostage by one man's sleep and by the terror of those around him. When Hitler finally woke, received the news, and gave the order to move, the morning was gone. The afternoon was going. The window that Rommel had said would decide everything had been open for 7 hours and was now closing fast. When the Panzer Lehr finally began moving toward Normandy, it moved in daylight, without air cover, under a sky controlled entirely by the Allies. Every crossroads became a target. Every stretch of open road became a shooting range. Bayerlein arrived in Normandy with a division that had been bled before it ever fired at an Allied soldier. The weeks that followed were slow torture. The grand counterattack that von Rundstedt had envisioned, the single decisive armored blow that would end the battle, was tried again and again in different forms and failed every time. Every concentration of German armor was spotted from the air and broken apart by artillery before it could move. Every attempt to reinforce the front was met by fighter bombers. Every road to Normandy became a killing ground. The German army in France was not fighting a battle anymore. It was fighting a siege, pressed from the front by Allied infantry, hunted from above by Allied aircraft, and forbidden from withdrawing by Hitler's absolute command. No retreat. Stand fast. Hold the line. Die in place. Through all of it, the ghost of Rommel's argument was present. He had been right. He had not been right about everything. His prediction that the landing would come at the Pas de Calais had been wrong. But his core insight, the one he had fought for and been denied, had been proved correct in the most brutal way possible. The first hours had been decisive. The panzers that might have changed everything were held back by a command structure that required waking a sleeping dictator. And the one man who had understood all of this and designed a plan around it had been driving through Bavaria when the moment came. By August of 1944, the bill came due in full. After a final German counterattack at Mortain was smashed by Allied armor and aircraft, the Allied armies swung in a massive encircling movement and closed around nearly 100,000 German soldiers near the town of Falaise. The trap was total. The only way out was a narrow corridor 20 miles wide between the towns of Troon and Chambois. Allied artillery observers on the surrounding hills could see the entire length of that corridor, and into it they poured an unbroken river of high explosive shells that never stopped, day or night, until the trap was shut. What happened inside the Falaise pocket was not a battle. It was the end of an army. The roads were blocked not by enemy soldiers but by the wreckage of Germany's own forces, burning tanks, overturned trucks, the carcasses of thousands of horses, the animals that had pulled the guns and supply wagons of the German infantry, lying in enormous silent heaps across the sunken Norman lanes. An SS Panzer officer would abandon his burning tank and run on foot with a frightened teenager beside him, both of them equal now, both of them with the same single goal: to get through the corridor, to stay alive. Above them all, the fighter bombers circled and dove, without pause on anything that moved. By August the 21st, the gap was closed. The trap had shut. Inside the pocket, the German army in the West had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The men who staggered out across the river dives to the German lines were not soldiers. They were ghosts, men without weapons, without units, without the faintest trace of the certainty with which they had stood in their Atlantic Wall bunkers 10 weeks before. Rommel did not see Falaise. In July, an Allied fighter bomber had strafed his staff car on a Norman road. He had been thrown through the windshield. His skull was fractured in 3 places. He was taken to a hospital in Germany. Even at the end, the Jabos had found him. He would die in October 1944. Not from his wounds. From a cyanide capsule carried by 2 German generals who came to his door and offered him a choice between a show trial and a quiet death that would be reported as a hero's end. He chose the capsule, in part to protect his family from reprisals. He was buried with full military honors. The Desert Fox. The man who had read the future clearly and been denied the tools to change it. Here is the truth at the center of everything that happened in Normandy in the summer of 1944. The Allied invasion was not a military problem that German tactical genius could solve. It was an industrial problem. The Allies did not merely have more men and more machines. They had a system, a factory of war that produced tanks and trucks and planes in such quantities that no amount of German skill could compensate for the disparity. Against that system, the only German response that had any chance was speed. Hit the Allies before the system could engage. Catch them in the first hours, before the air cover was established and the supply ships were running and the great machine was in motion. After those first hours, the outcome was no longer a question of military genius or tactical courage or German willpower. It was arithmetic. And arithmetic always wins. Rommel's one fatal mistake was not personal. It was not leaving for Bavaria. It was not trusting a weather report. His fatal mistake was this. He served a system that had placed all decisive authority in the hands of a single man who could not be woken up. He understood the flaw. He fought against it. He was overruled. And he built the best possible plan within the constraints he was given, knowing all along that the constraints might kill the plan before the battle even began. He was right about that too. The Atlantic Wall did not fall because the Allies were stronger on the beach. It fell because the man who understood how to defend it was denied the command structure he needed to do so. Rommel knew exactly what was required. He said it clearly, in writing, months before the invasion came. He was denied it by a compromise between two military doctrines and one man's refusal to be woken. And when the critical moment arrived, in the gray dawn of June the 6th, when the largest armada ever assembled appeared on the horizon like a city rising from the sea, the man who had designed the only possible defense against it was singing Happy Birthday in Bavaria. He had written it himself. The beaches were where the war would be won or lost. There would be only one chance. The first 24 hours would decide everything. He was right. He was not there. And the chance was gone before he could reach it.